In Geneva, China has complained to the World Trade Organization about Australia's ban on Chinese 5G technology. What message does this send about China's resolve to protect the legitimate rights of its companies? And in Beijing, China's newly reconstituted search and rescue team has returned from its first overseas mission to cyclone-devastated Mozambique. What impact did the team have on the ground and for China's growing contributions to international assistance? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. China is pushing back against what it views as discrimination against Chinese brands in 5G technology by the Australian government. On Friday, China made a complaint to the World Trade Organization, specifically to its Council on Trade in Goods in Geneva. China didn't mention any Chinese company by name, but assailed Australia's move as obviously discriminative and a violation of global trade rules. On Sunday, the Australian government remained defiant, saying they will stick to their ban of the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Last August, Australia barred Huawei from supplying any technology to its 5G network, citing national security risks. However, they have produced no evidence to back up their claims. Will China move forward and initiate what's known as a dispute settlement, or in layman's terms, will it formally sue Australia at the WTO? What impact might that have on bilateral ties, if any? Joining me from Sydney, Australia is Hendrischke, a professor of Chinese business and management at the University of Sydney Business School, and from Geneva, Switzerland, Xiankun, an Emeritus professor at the University of International Business and Economics here in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Liu, let me go to you first. You were a former Chinese diplomat with the World Trade Organization. Explain a little bit exactly what China did last Friday. So China put forward this complaint, but it didn't really file any formal request for consultation, right? In layman's term, that would mean China officially sued Australia to the kind of court of international trade. Professor Liu, what are we looking at this stage?
Thank you, Liu Xin. This is something very common, kind of happens every day, every minute in the WTO, that one member, like China, has a concern on the trade policy or practices by another member, like Australia. And then so it raises this concern at the relevant WTO body. So for this one is the Committee on Trade in Goods, and then ask questions. So I think that's basically the thing you do to raise a concern, make it public, put it on the record of the WTO, ask questions and for answers, verification, and then you study them and how to further proceed. But this is, as you said, far from a formal dispute settlement, a kind of a complaint, because that's totally different. This is just first step for members to seek consultations to resolve it in a kind of peaceful way, less confrontational than a formal dispute case.
Well, during that meeting, Chinese representative told Australia its restriction on Chinese 5G telecom technology was obviously discriminative, and measures to restrict 5G technology had a great impact on international trade and would not address concerns about cyber security, but only make countries technologically isolated. Some are saying the move appears to be a new tactic by Beijing in its efforts to overturn Australia's decision last year to ban Huawei. Professor Liu, how would you interpret China's action at the WTO? What exactly is China asking for here? For Australia to revert its decision?
Well, it remains a question mark, because this is still a kind of first step, and China asks questions and then raises concerns. And next step will be that Australia will respond to the questions, because at this meeting, last Friday meeting, Australia didn't have the time enough time to respond, to study the questions and respond to them. So we will need some time to see what kind of responses they provide and whether that responses satisfy kind of China's to resolve China's concerns. And after that, it will be China's decision whether they will continue to pursue these in that kind of in the WTO meetings, and then whether they will further ask more questions and get answers.
Okay.
But the other thing is that not only in the WTO, I'm sure that China and Australia have bilateral FTA, and there are many other mechanisms they will further pursue this.
Professor Hendrischke, now China said Australia's move appeared to break global trade rules, but some are saying they can cite national security to gain an exemption from the normal trade rules. Yet last week, the first ever WTO ruling clarified the use of the national security exemption and set a clear test for its use. Apart from war and arms trade, national security generally meant a situation of armed conflict or of latent armed conflict or of heightened tension or crisis or of general instability engulfing or surrounding a state. So in this regard, does Australia's ban on Huawei for national security concerns hold water?
Well, the situation is slightly more complex because, as we just heard, what China did was to raise an informal complaint. An informal complaint is different from a formal complaint in the sense that what is requested from Australia now is a first initial response to this informal complaint. The question whether Australia justifies its ban of Huawei equipment on the grounds of national security or on the grounds that the Australian policy is not discriminatory, that is something that would only have to be answered in a formal way if China made a proper formal complaint. At the moment, what we've had as the Australian response to this informal complaint was our Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, saying Australia stands by its original decision, but the original decision basically justifies the ban by saying there's a possibility of an extrajudicial request by a foreign government. So the justification that was not given in WTO terms. If we had a formal complaint, then we would move into WTO territory, and then to justify it in a formal way by national security would raise the issues that you just mentioned. Otherwise, if the justification was to say it's not discriminatory, that would also raise issue, because the question of discriminatory is either a legal issue or it's a de facto issue. Legal, it might sound fine, but de facto it might be an issue if it is a de facto discrimination. So once we come to a formal stage, we're entering much more complex territory than we do at the moment, where the justification is largely a political one for a domestic audience.
Well, in the statement, as you mentioned, by the Australian Trade Minister Simon Birmingham on Sunday, he said that the Australian government stands by its decision in relation to 5G, which was not targeted at any one country or telecommunications company. But however, as you mentioned, there is a legal discrimination and there is a de facto discrimination here. Actually, immediately after the ban last August, Huawei Australia announced that they have been informed by the government that they have been banned from providing technology to the Australian market. So would that constitute some kind of de facto discrimination? Because obviously, to our knowledge, no other telecom companies from other countries have been informed that they are barred from the Australian market. Professor Hendrischke.
That's correct. The question is really in what forum do we act here? If it's a formal WTO forum, then suddenly all the terminology gains weight. And something that was not considered originally is that, of course, in the meantime, since the ban was issued in August last year, there have been changes within the WTO, for example, in the way in which national or security interest, national security, is interpreted, and these notions can now be challenged in the WTO. That was something that was not originally part of the whole ban as it was issued. That in fact it could be challenged on formal grounds. And at the moment we are not at that stage, but if China pursues a formal complaint, we might come to that stage. The other point you mentioned is that, and that is an internal matter in Australia, that Huawei has not received an official explanation for the ban. That is the case, and that is something that the Australian chairman of Huawei, former Admiral John Lord, has also complained about. So there's a whole range of issues at stake. The most, in a way, the most urgent and the most serious one will be if it's a formal complaint with WTO.
So, Professor Liu, given all of the things that we have covered so far, how big of a chance does China have in winning if it initiates a formal complaint against the Australian ban? How likely is China winning this case?
For the moment, I think it's still hard to see because at this first day, China made basically 3 points. First, that obviously Australian ban is discriminatory, but the second thing is that it's also non-transparent, but also not using international standards. But on the other thing, we know that on the WTO rules, this as Professor Hendrischke said, that exception that you could use is based on the national security reasons. That's something we need to see how Australia could justify from it. But this from a prima facie kind of analysis of the case, I think it is hard that the Australia could justify this because quite some recent rulings of the WTO have already made a strict kind of test and also conditions on how you could apply that. I think that's the most hard part. Of course, before a kind of formal complaint, I hope that China-Australia could resolve this through this kind of less confrontational consultations under the Trade in Goods Committee, because that's where members usually do it. On last Friday, actually, if I could say it, that there are altogether 25 specific trade concerns raised by a number of members against a number of practices by Australia and in China itself and also EU-US. So that's, I think, the way to do it better than a formal dispute settlement.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Hans Hendrischke, Professor of Chinese Business and Management at the University of Sydney Business School, and from Geneva, Switzerland, Xiankun, Emeritus Professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing.